Since the 2020 election, we've seen a number of warning signs that Democrats are steadily losing support from Latino voters. First, several predominantly Latino areas, including border towns in Texas, shifted significantly toward Trump in 2020. More recently, 538 found that Biden had lost more support from Latinos than from any other racial or ethnic group. Judging by the latest polling, this trend has only gotten worse as we approach midterms. A recent Quinnipiac poll put Biden's approval rating at a miserable 26% among Latino voters, which again was the lowest approval rating of any group surveyed. Given that Latinos currently make up one of the fastest growing demographic groups in the US and have the potential to make or break elections in competitive congressional districts and in swing states, these trends could spell electoral disaster for Democrats. In other words, anyone who doesn't want Republicans to control every branch of government at the national level should be interested, to say the least, in understanding exactly why Latino voters are abandoning Democrats. Over the past few years, a growing number of liberal commentators have argued that it's because Latinos are increasingly identifying as white. For instance, after Trump increased his share of Latino voters in 2020, one contributor to CNN wrote, "As Latinos settle and integrate, fewer are likely to think of themselves as immigrants and may increasingly embrace an expanded sense of white identity. If this is the case, these voters will not see themselves as the target of attacks on demographic change, and there will be minimal pressure for the Republican Party to pull back from its race-based appeals and culture wars." Another contributor to the Washington Post wrote, "What are we to make of Latino voters inspired by Trump? I call this phenomenon multiracial whiteness. The promise that they too can lay claim to the politics of aggression, exclusion, and domination. Multiracial whiteness promises Latino Trump supporters freedom from the politics of diversity and recognition." And here's a former Hillary Clinton campaign director arguing that Latino voters' abandonment of Democrats has nothing to do with the Democrats themselves, and that it's actually all about Latinos' relationships to whiteness.
Right? I think it goes beyond politics. It goes beyond strategy. It goes beyond Democrats needing better strategies, better tactics, better messaging, knocking on doors, not 2 weeks before, but 2 years before. I think what we're seeing right now and what we see on those numbers is that there is a cultural identity crisis that we are undergoing as a community that is completely splitting and dividing Latinos. And in this crisis, you have on the one hand, Latinos that believe that in order to achieve the American dream, you have to get as close as possible to whiteness. And that is something that Trump gave them permission to do. And on the other hand, you have Latinos that believe that in order to achieve the American dream, you have to get as far as possible from whiteness.
Now, to be clear, plenty of Latinos do identify as white. According to the Pew Research Center, around 60% of Latinos in the US today consider themselves white. However, I'm not convinced that whiteness really explains why Latino voters are souring on Democrats. The underlying assumption here seems to be that as Latinos are being assimilated into whiteness, their politics are moving to the right because they're now theoretically able to reap the various social benefits of white supremacy. To me, this argument seems like a weird funhouse mirror version of demographic destiny, which of course refers to the idea that as the US population becomes less white, the country will get more progressive. This version of demographic destiny, on the other hand, just inverts that by assuming that as a group becomes more white, their politics will go in the other direction. Both versions of demographic destiny let Democrats off the hook by suggesting that racial identity is the primary force that shapes people's politics, and that there's very little that Democrats can do to counter this. Even if that may be true in some cases, I'm not sure that we actually have a ton of evidence to support the idea that racial identity is what's motivating a significant number of Latino voters today. To put it another way, presuming that Latinos are leaving the Democratic Party because they're embracing whiteness seems unnecessarily speculative. If we want to figure out what motivates a critical mass of Latino voters to cast ballots for some candidates over others, why not just start by taking them at their word? Polls and surveys show over and over that overwhelming majorities of Latino voters consistently rank their top issues as the economy, jobs, and healthcare. Here's how Democratic strategist and former Bernie Sanders advisor Chuck Rocha recently explained it.
Always with Latinos, it's about jobs, economy, and providing for their family. In Latino focus groups that we're currently doing across the country, some of the top issues are what are the party, Democrat or Republican, going to do to make my job or my life better? Gas is going up. Right now, it's currently going down. Bread's been going up. The cost of things overall has went up. They want to know, what are you going to do immediately to help me? It helped Democrats to say that we got everybody vaccinated and that we had relief checks. But now folks want to know, what are you going to do to ease up the pressure that they feel in everyday life? So blue collar, working class issues are issues that resonate with Latinos. Jobs, economy, healthcare, education are normally the top three.
The polling firm Ekis, which specializes in outreach to Latino voters, confirmed these priorities in their own study, which came out last year. They found that one reason why Trump got a boost among Latino voters is because although a majority said they did not approve of Trump overall, they did approve of his handling of the economy during the pandemic. 77% of Latino voters in 2020 approved of stimulus checks, which, if you recall, were first issued during Trump's term. 66% said they supported Trump's position on reopening the economy, and 55% said they supported the idea of, quote, living without fear of COVID. That's likely due to the fact that Latinos are disproportionately employed in the sectors of the economy that were hit the hardest by shutdowns, including food service and hospitality. On the other hand, as I've discussed before, most people in the US right now perceive Joe Biden and the Democrats to be weak on the economy. Yes, unemployment went down and GDP rose during Biden's first year in office, but at the same time, inflation has wiped out wage gains and the cost of things like food and gas has gone up significantly. So with Latinos, you have a group of largely working class voters that care about the economy and bread and butter issues above all, and then you have a political party that keeps saying the economy is doing great, but isn't actually delivering much relief to working people. Is it any surprise that these voters are becoming more and more disillusioned? Maybe we wouldn't see this mass exodus of Latino voters from the Democrats if the party actually ran candidates focused on working class economics. Relatedly, I also have to address the claim that Latino voters are uniquely susceptible to right-wing fear-mongering around the threat of socialism, because this always comes up whenever people discuss Latinos moving to the right politically. Here's one example.
Because Republicans have figured out what dirty politics means in the sense of how to get Latinos, and that is by exploiting one of their biggest and deepest fears and traumas, and that is the fear of socialism. Right, because they know that what many millions of Latinos have in common in this country is that one of the very reasons why they come to this country isn't necessarily to flee socialism, but to flee a form of authoritarianism, right? To flee a form of an unbalance of power. And that resonates, right? And they've tapped into that fear and they've figured out that the most persuasive way to get them is through fear.
Now, it's true that in the abstract, the word socialism doesn't pull well with Latino voters. The same goes for most Americans. But if it's truly the case that Latinos are drifting away from the Democrats because they're put off by anything even remotely associated with word socialism, someone still has to explain why in the 2020 Democratic primaries, Latinos voted by huge margins for the socialist. Exit polls from the 2020 primaries show that Bernie Sanders overwhelmingly won Latino voters in early states. In Nevada, Sanders won 53% of Latino voters compared to the 17% who voted for Biden. In Texas, Bernie won 39% of Latino voters, whereas Biden won 26%. And in California, Bernie won 49% of Latino voters and Biden won 19%. To drive this point home even further, let's take a look at how the neighborhoods with the highest percentage of Latino residents in Los Angeles voted in 2020. East LA, which is almost 97% Latino, voted for Bernie. Maywood, which is over 96% Latino, voted for Bernie. Walnut Park, Huntington Park, and Boyle Heights, all of which are around 95% Latino, you guessed it, all of these neighborhoods voted for Bernie. The reason why I bring up Bernie Sanders is because he basically did what I think all Democrats could and should be doing if they want to win back Latino voters. He campaigned early and hard in states with large Latino populations, he concentrated bilingual outreach efforts in Latino neighborhoods, and he stuck to bread and butter issues. As the co-founder of Ekis put it, a lot of what he did was not rocket science. In about 6 months, we'll be facing midterm elections. Senate seats in several states with sizable Latino populations, particularly Arizona and Nevada, will be in play. In other words, Democrats have a rapidly shrinking window in which they'll be able to make their case to Latino voters. Thanks to the Sanders campaign, we already have one partial blueprint for how to do this. But whether mainstream Democrats will choose to take any lessons from it at all is unfortunately another matter entirely. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.